Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here to share something about our co-foundress. To speak about Saint Maria Dominica Mazzarello, the co-founder of the Salesian Sisters, in relation to Don Bosco and other SDB, could be a mystery to some, since little is known about her. Of course, in one presentation, I cannot dissipate the mystery, but I hope that by the end of this talk, your perceptions of her are a bit clearer and deeper. While the focus of this presentation is Maria Dominica Mazzarello, without Don Bosco's intervention in her life, she definitely would not be known in more than 100 countries around the world today. I have entitled this presentation, Maria Dominica Mazzarello's Unique Contribution to Our Shared Salesian Charism. Maria Mazzarello was the eldest of 13 children, and the first daughter of Mary, Help of Christians. As I share this life, I would like us all to reflect on aspects of Maria's life through Psalm 139, so as not to leave this presentation in the past and just bring out aspects of someone else's life and leave it at that. Psalm 139 challenges us all to thank God for each of our lives and all aspects of it, and live it to its fullest potential in whatever pathway the Lord calls us to follow. God leads us in every area of our lives. Nothing is too big or too small for God. And the best part is, God knows best. God leads us to the best version of ourselves, not just our whole lives, but every aspect of it. So, as I just shared, Maria Mazzarello was the eldest of 13 children and the first daughter of Mary, Help of Christians. She lived for 42 years of her 44 years in the village of Monese, belonging to the region of Piedmont in the Diocese of Acqui. While Monese belongs to the region of Piedmont, it is geographically situated close to Genoa, and therefore her area gravitated more to the social, political, and religious life of Genoa rather than Turin. This simple fact had a great impact on the life of Maria Mazzarello, as will be presented in this presentation. The outline I would like to develop has several points. There is a premise, a timeline for those who know nothing about Maria Dominica between that of herself and Don Bosco, noting similarities and differences. The influence of a lay association upon her life, the pious union of the Daughters of Mary Immaculate. And that moves me into an eclectic spirituality focusing on a very optimistic Christian humanism, with emphasis on the spirituality of St. Francis of Sales. And lastly, I would like to, if time permits, just point out significant SDB in the life of Maria Dominica. So what is my premise? God creates neither saints nor institutions according to one set pattern. Each has a mission and a particular makeup. This applies to Don Bosco and Maria Mazzarello as it does to each one of us. Both were influenced by their childhood, their social, political, religious background, and opportunities. Maria Mazzarello did not become a photographic image of Don Bosco because she became the founder of the Salesian Sisters, even if she grew up in the same culture and the same century. Differences of age, family upbringing, gender, education, opportunities, interests, and talents led each to contribute in their own right to a sound, optimistic Catholic spirituality. This goes for the universal church, represented in an eclectic way within the Salesian family of saints, blesseds, venerables, and servants of God. So, as we begin, I invite us all to gradually pray Psalm 139 as I present aspects of the life and spirituality of Maria Mazzarello, in the hope that this psalm can come alive for each one of us throughout this day. Lord,
you said to me, and you know me. You know if I am standing or sitting. You read my thoughts from far away. Whether I walk or lie down, you are watching. You are intimate with all my ways.
To help us put this presentation in some perspective, I am making a quick comparison between the lives of Don Bosco and Maria Domenica. Both Don Bosco and Maria Domenica Mazzarello have been termed social saints of Piedmont, Italy during the 19th century, each making their own contribution to meeting the needs of people, especially the young. As we know, Don Bosco was born in 1815 and died in 1888. Maria Mazzarello was born 22 years later in 1837 and dies before Don Bosco in 1881. Don Bosco was born in a tiny little hamlet of Becchi, as we know. He has his famous dream around 1824. He had a very complex childhood and yet enters the seminary in 1835. So this is a 20-year period. A year before Maria Mazzarello is born, there's a votive chapel dedicated not far from her native house, dedicated to Mary, Help of Christians. So this title was known to Maria Domenica right from childhood. She's born a year later, also in a very tiny little hamlet, probably a little bit bigger than Becchi, called the Mazzarelli, in the village of Mornese. In 1841, as you know, Don Bosco becomes a priest and begins his wandering oratory and settles in the Penardi area, which is now known as Valdocco. And Maria is a little toddler running around the hamlet of the Mazzarelli. In 1850, in Mornese, Maria Mazzarello begins to help her father in the fields. Why? Family of 13 children. After Maria was born, 3 children die in infancy, so the father is left with very little help, with the mother at home raising the family. So Mary Mazzarello, who had quite strong health, was quite happy to help her father in the fields. In 52, Don Bosco dedicates the Church of St. Francis of Sales, and in the same year, Mary Mazzarello is about 15. She strengthens her interaction among young people and deepens her Eucharistic and Marian piety. In 1854, we know the dogma of the Immaculate Conception was proclaimed. At this point, Don Bosco calls his first helpers Salesians, and this is a very important point in the life of Maria Domenica. A contemporary of hers called Angela Macagno, about 5 years her senior, starts a lay association for single women. And she dedicates it to Mary because the dogma had just been proclaimed. And Maria herself is one of the first members. And here she's about 17 years of age. In 59, as you know, a small band of young men accept to stay with Don Bosco and work for the education of poor boys. And here is a very strong moment in Maria's life. She continues to help in the house. She continues to be an active member of this lay association, but she's struck with typhoid. Italy in this era is rampant with wars here and there, and men come back with disease, and the whole village is struck with typhoid. She of good health, the family, none in the family contract typhoid, but her uncle's family all contracted it. And she's asked to go and help this family of hers. She does. She accepts, saying that, I know I'm going to catch the disease, and so she did. And her whole life changes at this point, because she can no longer help her father in the fields, and it's a very discerning moment. She didn't know where to turn, what to do in her life. It took months and months of recovery. She nearly died. They had already sent the roses from Genoa for her funeral. That's how bad she was. But she recovers, but with no health. Can't even help the mother in the home, never mind the father in the fields. So gradually, she wants to continue to help young girls and teenagers. What does she do? This is a bit of history. The Cassati law came into Italy in 1860. She's already in her 20s. So she missed out on education. It was a law that allowed boys and girls to receive 2 years of elementary education. So her contemporary, Angela Macagno, who came from an affluent family, was sent to Genoa for a year and was trained to be the first teacher in Monese. But of course, Mary Mazzarello missed out. But what does she say? These young girls receive only 2 years of an elementary education. So what does she do? She starts a professional school in 1862 with her friend Petronilla, who became her lifelong friend, even as a daughter of Mary, Help of Christians. She starts a professional school in Monese, wants to open a shop. Once unheard of for a single woman to open a shop in town, competing with the tailor. She starts a boarding school, and she starts a Sunday oratory. She doesn't know who Don Bosco is. So it's just amazing how this all came to be. So from a very perplexing time in her life, God reveals his plans. So for us, Psalm 139 calls us to thank God for all of our lives, what we understand and don't. So too for our saints. Look at Don Bosco, look at Maria Dominica. She had no idea that what she started in 1862 would now extend throughout the whole world. In 64, it's the catalyst year where Mary Mazzarello does meet Don Bosco. How? He actually comes to Monese on his last autumn walk, and he brings 100 boys to Monese from Turin. They went by train to Gavi. That must have been something. Imagine 100 boys from Valdocco on a train to Gavi. Wow. Anyway, why? Because Father Pestorino, who met, he was the curate in Monese. He met Don Bosco at a priest's meeting, was very fascinated by Don Bosco. By this time, he was very well known. And Father Pestorino invites Don Bosco to Monese to see what he's doing in his parish. Not only for women in this association, but he also establishes groups for young men. And he revives the whole parish of Monese. He was from Monese himself and was trained in Genoa. So at the invitation of Father Pestorino, Father Pestorino invites Don Bosco to come to Monese. Father Pestorino is so fascinated by Don Bosco that Father Pestorino becomes a Salesian. We're not sure of the date, but it was before he came to Monese in 1864. Father Pestorino, too, came from a fairly affluent family. He owned land. So as an SDB, he gave over his inheritance to the congregation. What does Don Bosco do? He comes to Monese for the first time. He does meet Maria and this group of dedicated women. But Don Bosco proclaims that since there's land in Monese, given by Father Pastorino after he became a Salesian. He's going to build a boarding school for boys. And of course, everybody in the village is absolutely thrilled with this idea, and they begin the work straight away. However, 3 years later, crash bang, the bishop comes in and says this school cannot be for boys. It was half finished. Why? Well, if Don Bosco built a boarding school for boys at that era in 1864, if any boys wanted to go on to the priesthood, most of them didn't join the diocese, they joined Don Bosco. So the bishop said, sorry, this school cannot be for boys. What happens providentially, and again this is Psalm 139, is that the school was finished, but it becomes the first school for the Daughters of Mary, Help of Christians, still in existence today. God has his ways. In 68, the Basilica of Mary, Help of Christians is consecrated. 69, as you know, Society of St. Francis of Sales is approved. It's in this period from 64 and even before that many people were asking, can Don Bosco found a congregation for women to do what he's doing for boys so that it can be done for girls as well? As you know, Don Bosco was reluctant in the beginning, not because he had a difficulty dealing with women, but he had enough on his plate. Anyway, the persistence kept coming. He was then very interested in this group at Monese. He was interested in a woman in Brescia and also a woman in Turin. So he was shopping around. But finally, I'm saying this. Okay, I got it. In 71, I'm saying this story very quickly, the SDB General Council approves the establishment of a congregation of women whose aim is the education of girls and young women. And Don Bosco chooses this group of women that he's fascinated with. He's never seen a lay association of this sort. So I'm saying in an 8-year period from 64 to 72, our congregation began on the 5th of August with 11 young women, including Mary Mazzarello as its leader, and 4 novices. However, again, struck with whatever, Don Bosco, seeing the aptitude of Father Pastorino, he left Father Pastorino in charge of the newly founded congregation. But he dies 2 years later, suddenly, from a stroke. So what does Don Bosco do? He begins to send the SDBs to Monese. He makes Father Giovanni Cagliero his delegate and sends other Salesians, as we'll see as the story develops, to guide the new congregation. On the Salesian side, there's the first missionary journey to South America, which you know. The 76, the Salesian cooperatives are established, and we join the second group of SDBs going to South America. Mary Mazzarello dies in 81. I'm saying this story very, very quickly, but she dies in Nizza, not in Monese, because 2 years prior to that, our mother house was moved from Monese to Nizza to be closer to town. It wouldn't be so isolated. It was easier to get young people to Nizza than to Monese. And as you know, Don Bosco dies in 1888. In 5 minutes, I'm trying to say the whole life of Mary Mazzarello, but at least you've got a little bit of some sort of a picture. So let us pray. In this short sketch of both these lives, I now present some of the similarities and differences that make both these people unique and irreplaceable in God's designs. Before we reflect on the similarities and differences of Don Bosco and Maria Mazzarello, I would like to reflect on what it was like to be a woman in 19th century Italy. For the most part of the century, women were not allowed to be educated unless they had the financial resources to receive private tuition, and when they did, the subject matter received was mainly geared to women's role in the home. This applies both to Maria Mazzarello. She couldn't be educated. The family of 13 children, they had no financial means. And yet her contemporary, also of Morenese, Angela Macagno, who starts the Lay Association, was able to be educated. She went to Genoa and becomes the first primary school teacher for girls back in Morenese. Women were considered morally fragile and needed to be watched either by their parents or by their husbands, as the case may be. I'm glad you're chuckling. In any social institution, be it within the Italian state or church, women were held subordinate to men and instilled to practice passive virtues of humility, obedience, self-sacrifice, and mortification. Coupled with the above, women in this region and era lived through the Risorgimento, the Italian political revolution, reason why Maria Mazzarello contracts typhoid, which raised national consciousness of armed conflict and social and ecclesial disruptions. Vatican I was never finished. But this is the world that Maria Mazzarello experienced as woman. However, there are women, Maria Mazzarello and Angela Macagno included, who did not fit this mold, as we will see in this presentation. So what was Don Bosco's relationship with women? Some people give him a negative plug, which I don't think is fair. Don Bosco was a person of his time, so was Maria Mazzarello. Girls and boys, men and women, remained separate in most spheres of life. His priestly formation would have stressed that, this is from Father Cafasso, his spiritual director, women and priests should stay as far apart as two poles. However, for Don Bosco, the relationship was not so cut and dry. We know his great love for the Mother of God. His close collaborators were his mother and then the mother of Father Rua. He had many benefactors, and a lot of them were women. In our case, the Marchioness Juliette Barolo in Valdocco and Countess Corsi in Nizza. Of course, religious women, Mary Mazzarello herself, other religious women, and also in the field of education as our congregation began to develop. So what are the similarities between these two figures? Both were used to hard work and rural country life. Gradually, they grew up in their human understanding of life and their Christian faith. Interestingly enough, both of them at an early age were not fond of lengthy prayers, but meaningful and relevant ones. Right from when they were young, they loved to be around other children and adolescents, and both demonstrating leadership skills. They were both creative, inventive, inquisitive, strong-willed. Mary Mazzarello was very strong-willed, and so was Don Bosco. They were eager to learn new things into adulthood. They were avid readers, as you'll see as I present this. They stretched boundaries for the good of young people. They were influenced by their parents and clergy, and both had close friends. They were conscious that Italy was in political turmoil, aware of anti-clerical forces against the church. And in different ways, this is important to today's presentation, they both absorbed the classical works of Francis de Sales, Teresa of Avila, Ignatius of Loyola, Philip Neri, and today's feast day of Vincent de Paul. They were both contrary to Jansenistic practices, which was rampant in France and Italy at the time. The anthropology from Jansenism is theological pessimism, whereas both Don Bosco and Maria Mazzarello were very optimistic about the human condition. In Jansenism, it denies the role of free will in the acceptance and use of grace. It's a negative view of human nature after the fall. Whereas both Don Bosco and Maria Mazzarello, both in their own eras, wanted a spirituality that was real, active. It was God's gift and the human response to that gift. Whereas in Jansenism, it was a rigorous tendency in all matters of ecclesial discipline to receive communion infrequently. We're not worthy. Well, none of us are worthy. There was a rigorism in morals, and there were devotional excesses. You needed to pray more to become holy. But for Don Bosco and Mary Mazzarello, they wanted frequent communion. Both had a very strong Marian spirituality. Joy and the value of friendship were prevalent. They mixed asceticism and mysticism together, the Martha and Mary of life. Both were passionate about young people. Don Bosco in Turin and Mary Mazzarello in Monese, neither knowing each other, which is amazing. Don Bosco, as you know, in the developing industrial city of Turin, and Mary Mazzarello in the rural countryside of Monese. Don Bosco, we know already, he visited the Turinese juvenile prisons and said, we've got to prevent all this. And there was the development of the preventive system. Mary Mazzarello wanted to give something more to girls and teenagers who could only be educated for 2 years. So she offers them a trade, starts the technical school in town, rents rooms. They actually cultivated silkworms to get money to pay for the rent. Girls were suffering from the loss of one or more than one or both parents, or children neglected by their parents. Our first teachers were lay teachers. Our first music teacher and French teacher were both lay women. What are the differences? And there are several. As we've just shared, Don Bosco born in 1815, Mary Mazzarello in 1837. There's a 22-year gap. Maria Mazzarello always saw Don Bosco as the leader, he being much older than she. Don Bosco was raised by one parent. Mary Mazzarello was raised by both parents. Don Bosco was the youngest. Mary Mazzarello was the oldest. Don Bosco came from a very dysfunctional childhood. Mary Mazzarello's childhood was quite stable. Don Bosco was supported by a brother and shunned by a stepbrother. But as you read his life, Anthony and Don Bosco in later life were quite on good terms. Mary Mazzarello was supported by brothers and sisters, but she also witnessed 6 siblings die in infancy. We don't have any record of what her impressions were of that, but it must have been quite strong. Don Bosco was schooled, even with a lot of difficulty. Mary Mazzarello received little schooling. Her father taught her to read as a young child. She was very good at maths on her fingers. They said she was quite intelligent, but she did miss out on formal education as a child. At an early age, Don Bosco left Becky and would return from time to time, whereas Mary Mazzarello stayed most of her 44 years of life, 42 of them, was in the village of Monese. Don Bosco, this is interesting because it develops as I go through this presentation. Don Bosco was influenced by the theology and spirituality of Turin, which was somewhat rigorous, and we know that from Don Bosco. Whereas the influence of theology and spirituality upon Maria Mazzarello was from Genoa, it was much more pastoral and inclusive, particularly for women. Don Bosco felt drawn to be a priest. Mary Mazzarello didn't. She thought that she had to have a dowry. So she even says that herself. Don Bosco was not acquainted, he says that himself, with lay movements, whereas Mary Mazzarello participated in one. Don Bosco had little support. We just mentioned, in his life he had 3 nervous breakdowns. He didn't have a lot of support. He did have some support, for sure, but not a lot. Whereas Mary Mazzarello was supported by Petronilla for her entire life. They met when they were about 13 years of age, and other members of the lay association. She didn't want to put a burden on her parents. Don Bosco wrote a great deal, as you all know. They say he wrote at least 6,000 letters and many, many publications, whereas for us, her only personal gift to us is her own personal correspondence. As shared, both Don Bosco and Maria Dominica were figures of their time and place, and also through their own ingenuity, foresightedness, and daring, improved the well-being of young people, each in their own right. So let us pray.
So it is too wonderful for me, I to my mind cannot reach. Where would I run from your spirit? Where would I flee from your presence?
As shared earlier, in the Diocese of Turin, Don Bosco was not acquainted with lay groups of committed women. The Diocese of Genoa, which was geographically closer to Monese than Turin, were promoting such groups. It is here where the uniqueness of Maria Dominica is very evident. At the age of 17, she becomes one of the founding members of the lay group of women initiated by a contemporary of hers, 5 years her senior, Angela Macagno. Angela felt called to initiate what today can be termed a secular institute, dedicating it to Mary Immaculate because of the dogma having just been proclaimed. She entitled it the Pious Union of the Daughters of Mary Immaculate. After a year of probation, mind you, single women could bind themselves together each week while still remaining with their families or at their employment, taking annual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, following a rule drawn up by Angela, working particularly for the good of girls and teenagers and also mothers of families. The rule also stated that they could work for men and boys if the need arose. Interesting. They met each week in one of the houses of the group and reflected on Christian ascetical texts and discussed the literature they read. Each week they planned how they would help others in Monese and surrounding villages. Here's a sample of some of the text that the group read. This is one entitled Spiritual Friendships by a Father Giuseppe Frasinetti, and a very important priest in Genoa, as well known as Don Bosco in Turin. A priest from Genoa, known by many, even Don Bosco knew him, for his pastoral approach in that diocese and the prolific literature he wrote for the adult population and for young people as well, boys and girls. His writings are as prolific as Don Bosco. Actually, Father Frasinetti wrote for Don Bosco's Letterature Cattoliche. Here is a book called A Spiritual Diary. It's a reflection on 12 virtues, one virtue for each month. The authorship is unknown, but it is steeped in Redemptorist tradition. And this is the Catholic Catechism in vogue in the Diocese of Acqui at that time. I'm presenting other texts, and I'll explain why in a minute. This is the rule, which was of the Pious Union, which Don Bosco was very interested in, and it was revised several times. We have other texts written by Father Frasinetti, particularly for this Pious Union. The works of Aloysius Rodriguez, a Spanish Jesuit, the works of Aloysius de Liguori, the founder of the Redemptorists, and the works of Teresa of Avila. Amazing what works this group were reflecting on each week. And of course, the Catholic Catechism in vogue at the time. Maria studied the new rule to see how it differed from the old. Maria enjoyed reading about the spread of the Pious Union. This Pious Union started in Little Monese, spread right throughout Italy in the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Amazing. Amazing. So what are the texts that Maria chose when she started her work with the girls and the teenagers? Amazing here too. Again, she selects the Catholic Catechism in vogue at the time, other works of Father Frasinetti, particularly written for girls. She still takes the works of Alphonsus de Liguori, the life of St. Aloysius Gonzaga. We think this is the life that Don Bosco wrote, because Don Bosco, when he begins to know about this association, starts to send his literature to this group. Another interesting person is this Elisabetta Girelli. It took me a while to find out who this person was, but she was a lay woman too in Brescia, who was doing similar things to what Angela Macagno was doing in Mornese. She wrote quite a bit for girls and teenagers. She even wrote commentaries on the gospel, which for a woman in that era was amazing, absolutely amazing. Maria Mazzarello continues to read the life of Teresa of Avila to the girls, and enter Don Bosco. Don Bosco sends, once he knows about this group, his own Il Giovane Provveduto. So, Maria read other popular booklets of Frasinetti. We don't know what they are. I accumulated about 30 titles, but there were other books that they read. We don't know what they are. She read some good book, especially St. Teresa. She obviously had a great devotion to Teresa of Avila. Maria, it also shares that Maria wanted to read Il Giovane Provveduto to the girls once Don Bosco sent it, and Maria read other spiritual books, but we don't know what they are. So there's quite a list. Quite a list. So why am I showing you this list of works? Here are the authors of these works. It is actually to share that Maria Mazzarello and the other committed women of her village were influenced by the classical writers of Catholic spirituality. I went through each of the texts, and there are about 30, and ascertained who the writers quoted, and the results are similar. The spiritualities of Teresa of Avila and Maddalena of Pazzi, both Carmelites. The writings of Francis de Sales, Philip Neri, Ignatius of Loyola, and today's feast day, St. Vincent de Paul. And notice Don Bosco, he's there in the middle, all right? He's quoting the same classical writers. The list goes on, and the source material is fairly identical. All the writers are quoting the key spiritualities of the Catholic Church. The earlier writers are quoting the fathers of the church. It's amazing that these women were depthing the spirituality of our Catholic faith at a very, very deep level. At the back on the bench there, I've put some of the works that the group were reflecting on. Our interest, of course, is St. Francis of Sales. Here, at random, I have chosen a few pages of the actual text of Father Frasinetti called La Monica in Casa, which means the nun in the home, or the religious sister in the home, written specifically for the Pious Union of the Daughters of Mary Immaculate. St. Francis of Sales and St. Jane de Chantal are quoted extensively. So I want to underline again, even though I've shared it, for 18 years, Maria Dominica went to the weekly meetings of the Pious Union of the Daughters of Mary Immaculate. Each week, the group reflected on extracts from classical spiritual work of our Catholic tradition. It is here that Maria and the other young women came in contact with the writings of Francis de Sales, Teresa of Avila, she had a great devotion to Teresa, Ignatius of Loyola, Philip Neri, Maddalena of Pazzi, etc. The question for all of us can be, well, what do I read? What do we read? This is amazing. And so let us pray.
If I go up to heaven, so there. If I make my bed in death, you are already there. If I go farther away with the wings of your home, I'll make my But even there your hand will guide me, your mighty hand holding me fast.
This brings me to share that Maria Mazzarello's spirituality is composed of a very eclectic style. She was exposed to a variety of spiritual orientations for 10 years before even meeting Don Bosco, through the pious union of the Daughters of Mary Immaculate, and continued in this association until the foundation of the Salesian Sisters 8 years later. In her correspondence, she reveals a very optimistic understanding of the human condition and Christian orientation. Where can all this be found? As shared, Maria Mazzarello wrote very little. Her personal correspondence is the Magna Carta for the Salesian Sisters, since we have no other known writings written by her. So briefly, I would like to share some key points of her spirituality through her own personal correspondence. The critique of the ascetical text Maria read forms part of the specific dimensions of Maria's own spiritual journey. It contests the widespread assumption that Maria's spirituality is predominantly related to that of Don Bosco's spiritual orientations. I do not deny the intervention, of course, of Don Bosco and the influence of his spirituality and other SDB upon the life and works of Maria Dominica. I challenge the acknowledgement of some scholars who place Don Bosco as the referent of Maria's total educational and spiritual orientations, which denies Maria her own experience and learning. Most of the ascetical texts Maria read largely affected her life prior to significant encounters with Don Bosco and others associated with him. So what are some of the key aspects in Maria Mazzarello's own correspondence? As shared, she obviously had a great devotion to Teresa of Avila and actually uses her words, "Everything passes, so let nothing disturb you." Words from Teresa of Avila. Everything serves to acquire true joy. Maria Mazzarello also read the text, The Way of Perfection of Teresa of Avila, which was a book Teresa wrote for her own sisters. And the three aspects of that are true humility, which means knowledge, and this is not the poor me syndrome, but knowledge of self, and this great love, and detachment from all that is not of God. In her era, the word mortification was rampant. She uses it at times, but if she really wants to use, and she doesn't use the word discernment, it wasn't in vogue then, but this is discernment, the detachment from all that is not of God, which means I've got to know what is of God and what is not. She uses a lot of, whoops, sorry about that. What's happened? Okay, hold on. I'm not pressing the right button, that's all. There we go. Father Frasinetti, in his works, he talks a lot about the defectiveness of our human condition, not the corruption of the works of Alphonsus Rodriguez, the Spanish Jesuit. He talks about that we are totally corrupt, which takes away this whole understanding of God's grace and our response to it. Father Frasinetti talks about defectiveness. Yes, we're all defective. None of us are perfect. And what does Mary Mazzarello say? We're defective, we're not perfect, we need determination, we need trust, whatever. So be happy. Be happy that we're not perfect, but rejoice in that. Don't go on a guilt trip, which is very interesting in her writings. And Father Frasinetti quotes a lot from the book of Proverbs. And so Mary Mazzarello talks also about the God will make you truly wise. From, of course, Don Bosco, this whole issue of joy, never lose the joy that God wants you to have, or Philip Neri. And this whole issue of living in the presence of God. For Don Bosco, he gave us, the FMAs, the model of Martha and Mary. The asceticism, the mysticism together. And that was in the 19th century. He gave us those two images, which is beautiful, together. From Francis de Sales, Chris on Monday gave this whole development of our spirituality based on the love of God and others. And it runs like a thread through Mary Mazzarello's letters. She explicitly says, with the girls, have great patience and endless kindness. Ignatius of Loyola, right through her letters, is the whole issue of the salvation of souls, the glory of God and the salvation of souls. And she has a great understanding of Marian spirituality. I was very surprised when I started all this reflection on her letters that she doesn't mention the rosary once, and I'm going, whoa, that's interesting. But going deeper into her letters, she actually wants us to make a parallel of imitating Mary by assessing our own journey as religious, which goes even much deeper. And she says, don't say more prayers, but say the prayers you're saying, say them in a better way. Amazing. So, let us pray.
If I say that darkness will hide me, and light will be my only light, even the darkness won't be dark to you, the light will shine like the day. Darkness and light are the same to you. Be ready to my inmost being to stitch me together in my mother's womb.
So of interest to us all is how Maria Mazzarello lived the spirituality of Francis de Sales as promoted by the Pious Union of the Daughters of Mary Immaculate, and later on by Don Bosco and other Salesians. As Chris shared so well the other day, St. Francis of Sales taught that the fundamental vocation of every Christian is love. He valued human effort, which Mary Mazzarello brings out in her letters, determination and joy, with a great trust and intimate relationship with God. From this model, which both Don Bosco and Mary Mazzarello were drawn to, is the art of educating with a positive outlook, and which has been handed down to us. So it is this love that is at the basis of every vocation. It's this optimistic interpretation of reality. It's understanding the person, not just looking at behavior. It's never giving up hope in the face of difficulties. And here's where Don Bosco said, Mary Mazzarello, our young people can become saints. Everyone can be holy, regardless of age or social condition. This great wise discernment of God's will. He has a whole thesis on that. This is the coherence between motivation and behavior. That gentleness with others is going to foster peace within myself. That every act of every day is an act of love of God. These are the exact words that Mary Mazzarello uses. And as one's heart is, as Chris shared on Monday, so is our own actions. So, the question for us is, how Salesian was Maria Mazzarello in her writings? What did she catch, counter, and recreate? Interesting, she doesn't mention the word Salesian or Salesians much in her letters. She does mention it, but not that frequently. She doesn't mention the feast day of Francis de Sales. And in one sense, she doesn't mention many of the Salesian catchphrases that we're so used to today. Assistance, dami animas, preventive system, honest citizen and good Christian, etc., etc. You might answer, doesn't sound very Salesian. Notwithstanding the above, Maria adopted some Salesian terminology, the oratory, the glory of God and the salvation of souls, the good night, Mary help of Christians, cooperators, Salesian missionaries, the salvation of souls. On the one hand, Maria did allude to some of Don Bosco's spiritual orientations, and on the other, Maria was at home in expressing her own unique originality. That said, we must realize that many of the phrases that we are so familiar with today, given to us by Don Bosco, didn't become catchphrases during Don Bosco's lifetime. Yes, Don Bosco visited Morenese about 15 times, but never stayed more than 2 or 3 days. Maria Mazzarello gradually got to know several key Salesians, Father Giovanni Cagliero, Father Giovanni Battista Lemweng. But in both congregations, things only formed gradually. So how Salesian was Mary Mazzarello? Mary Mazzarello was imbued with the spirituality of St. Francis de Sales, already in the pious union of the Daughters of Mary Immaculate, to becoming the leader of the Institute of the Daughters of Mary Help of Christians. So how apparent is Salesian characteristics found in her own correspondence? Francis de Sales will say that the Christian perfection is not based on extraordinary Christian practices, but on a down-to-earth love of God and neighbor. And so she will write, try, this is the journey, try to learn to love the Lord. The journey, the way of perfection. And to overcome yourself, this true humility, then everything else will be easily learned. Francis de Sales will say that holiness is achieved through the joyful fulfillment of God's will. Joyful fulfillment. This is Psalm 139, whether we understand something in our life and we don't, in whatever walk of life God calls us. So she writes, we must always make sacrifices while we're here on this earth. Let's make them how? Willingly and cheerfully. These are what makes the saints, and the Lord will take note of everything. Francis de Sales, that gentleness and meekness pervade the Christian encounter with others and fosters personal peace. Several times she'll say with the girls, practice endless patience and unlimited gentleness. How do you treat your sisters? With gentleness and charity? Are you peaceful and cheerful? And that there is a relationship between my motivation and my behavior. Remember that it's not enough to make good resolutions. We must put them into practice. I recommend purity of intention and humility of heart in all you do. Maria responded to the centrality of loving God and did not leave it in the realm of abstract spirituality. She admonished that each person relate to the other with a large, open heart, not a small, closed one. Respect for others was achieved with all one's heart, expressed not only in words. And a person's duty was not to be accomplished mechanically, but with the heart. When an individual expressed that there was little congruence between daily life and an encounter with God, she uses a very strong image, sores form in the heart, denoting intolerance of any difficulty. The same significance was applied when Maria wrote, the important thing is that you keep the garden of your heart in very good order. Ultimately, for Maria, it was a God who sees the heart. And this is also Don Bosco. Not only the desire to encounter God, but the courage to live life contingencies because of that encounter. Therefore, she says, take courage, be courageous and very cheerful. She couples courage and joy together right throughout her letters. I can be joyful but not courageous. I can be courageous but not joyful. This is the mark of a heart that loves God very much. Maria implied living Salesian spirituality when she consistently referred to love of God and love of neighbor as existential realities. This conceptualization was summed up by Maria when she wrote to a community leader, do freely all that love requires. These are the exact same words of Saint Jane de Chantal. The doing, it's the actions, not my pious thoughts or goodwill or intentions, but actual deeds. Freely, the need to be informed, the ability to make decisions, to take risks, to be misunderstood, to be creative. Everything, the intuition, the perception, the anticipation regarding one's needs and that of others, a consciousness of the demands or the depravity of the wider community. This great love, its compassion, as Chris has been sharing, compassion, kindness, acceptance of difference, tolerance, living beyond the letter of the law, which means I have to be challenged, I have to take risks, I have to endure, I have to invent. Therefore, let us pray.
Oh, Jesus, I thank you for the wonder of myself, for the wonder of your words. My soul knows its love. My frame was not hidden from you, while others being made in that secret place, knit together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my body even there. All of my days are written in your book. All of them planned before even the first attempt came to be.
I am coming to the end. I'd just like to briefly mention some of the significant SDB in the life of Maria Dominica. And of course, first and foremost is Don Bosco. Don Bosco knew Maria Mazzarello as a lay woman in the Pious Union of the Daughters of Mary Immaculate until her death in 1881. This quote comes from Father Cagliero, that he remembers Don Bosco's saying of Maria Dominica. Now, Mother Mazzarello possesses these qualities, the Salesian ones, so that we can be sure about the government of the Institute and the leadership of the sisters. She lives out our spirit, our system, and the specific nature of our oratory, and the deliberations of the Salesians. Their congregation is at the same level as ours. It has the same aims and means, which she inspires in the sisters by her teaching, example, and words. In her writing, she writes more frequently to Father Cagliero. She sometimes complains that Don Bosco never answers her. So, very interesting. Many of Maria Mazzarello's letters were lost or misplaced, so she wrote more than the 68 letters we have today. However, her interaction with the SDB is very evident in her correspondence. She wrote more frequently to Father Cagliero than with Don Bosco. There was only a year's difference in age between the two. It is Father Cagliero she wanted at her deathbed, and it actually happened. He was in Spain, but somehow he got to Nizza and was there by her bedside. As shared, Don Bosco was 22 years older than she. She always saw Don Bosco as the founder and leader. While she wrote cordially and frankly to him, she did so as the Mother General to the Rector Major. Instead, to Father Cagliero, she wrote to him about everything and anything. We also have correspondence from other Salesians, Father Costamagna, Father Lemwang, Father Rua, and Father Bonetti. You would have to know, however, while Don Bosco says our congregations are the same, our congregation was aggregated to the Salesian Society until 1911. What did that mean? It means we were not actually fully autonomous. All the finances were still under the SDB umbrella. Major decisions were also made with the SDB. What happened was that in 1901, Vatican put out a decree called Nome Secundum Quas, which, among other things, shared that female congregations still aggregated to a male congregation had to separate. Now, I don't know the impact of all the sisters, but the general gist of it was they thought that our congregation would collapse because we wouldn't be aggregated to the Salesian Society. Anyway, it took a good 10 years for this whole change, so all the finances had to be split. Lots of things had to happen. But on the 7th of September, 1911, the Institute became autonomous, pontifical. Okay, just for your information. Okay, so Father Cagliero becomes the Director General. He never lived for long periods of time at Mournese. He becomes the Director General and takes the place of Don Bosco. When Father Cagliero goes off to South America, it's Father Rua who becomes our delegate. And as I shared, there was a great cordial relationship between Maria Mazzarello and Father Cagliero. It was frequent, it was mutual, it was respectful, trusting, and the two of them got along very well. And as I shared, he took the place of Don Bosco. Father Pestorino becomes the first spiritual director. They actually started his course for canonization. I don't know whether it's continued or not. But as I shared, he was trained in Genoa under the leadership of this Father Frasinetti and came back to his own native village, which was Mournese. And I'd say he'd probably be the first parish priest, you could say, in the Salesian Society. Don Bosco didn't want him to join community. He remained in Mournese till his sudden death in 1874, and his main role after the congregation was founded was, of course, to look after our institute. He dies suddenly, as I shared, and it causes consternation for our congregation. But anyway, the congregation continued. The impact of the person of Father Pestorino was extremely significant, not only on the whole of Mournese, but particularly upon Maria Mazzarello and the Pious Union and the newly established congregation. He was Maria's spiritual director for 27 years. So personally, it's written that his death was a real blow to her, personally. Having known her since she was about the age of 10. He became a Salesian around, we're not sure when, 1860, and died suddenly in 1874. So after Father Pestorino, Don Bosco begins to send other Salesians to Mournese. We have no photograph of Father Giuseppe Cagliero, who was the cousin of Father Cagliero, but he too died at Mournese in 1874. So not many Salesians actually wanted to go to Mournese because they were afraid they were going to die. Anyway, we get Father Costamagna, and some of you Salesians know this image of this person. He was very, very strict. And he even admits it. He was there in Mournese for 3 years until he becomes the leader of the second SDB expedition to South America. He comes back to Italy. Mary Mazzarello is still alive. He writes her a letter saying, I'm coming back to Italy. Can you find a bed for me? And here's the phrase, even if sometimes I was too harsh to you. So he admitted that, he had gone overboard, and we've got some examples, no time to share them, but he was quite strict. And then when Father Costamagna went to South America, Father Pestorino sends his best men, and he sent Father Lemwang, there was a great collaboration between Mary Mazzarello and Father Lemwang. So it states there, and the sisters admitted that he was too harsh in his leadership of the community. And then we have the beautiful person of Father Lemwang, and there was a very strong collaboration between Mary Mazzarello and Father Lemwang. He was at her deathbed as well, but he found it too difficult when she was actually dying, and he actually left the room. That shows the relationship between himself and Mary Mazzarello. He was extremely supportive. So finally, let us pray.
How precious as those unto me, O Lord, I am lost to none of them. I do no more count them than I can count the sands. That was
so God is. So, what is Maria Mazzarello's unique contribution to our shared Salesian charism? I arrive at the end of this presentation with the same title I started with. She was a lay woman for 35 years and a religious leader for 9. Don Bosco and Maria Mazzarello were conditioned by their culture, but they also changed and developed it. They obviously questioned what was the accepted norm and reinterpreted it, each in their own unique and creative ways for the betterment of young people. And to me, as Salesians, this is our collective and individual calling. She was immersed in parish life as a lay woman for 35 years and as a religious for 9 for the good of young people. She crossed boundaries when it meant giving young people a better human and Christian upbringing. She read extensively, formed a very optimistic understanding of the human condition in Christ. She appreciated the value and meaning of lasting friendships. While Maria developed the initiative to start an emerging technical school in her village and could have continued on her own, she invites others to collaborate with her, each offering their own skills and talents for the good of young people. Maria images her relationship with Christ not only through Christ's passion and death, which was the prevalent image in her time, but through a variety of images. The infant Jesus, Jesus' spouse, even the risen Jesus, and particularly Jesus' heart. She never saw Jesus' heart as a place of suffering. That was the cross. But she saw the heart as a place of encounter, not of suffering, but of intimacy with him and everyone else. She refrains from strict hierarchical dualisms and integrates many aspects of life into one. She'll write, take care of your health and work all for Jesus. She acknowledges one's vulnerability, but she said, don't fall into a heap. Don't go on a guilt trip. Remain happy and serene. Work on yourself, yes. She couples goodness and cheerfulness and singing and laughter. She wants the fervor of a novice, those beginning the journey, with the solid virtue. And note the verb, that the solid virtue the religious should have. Should couple health, cheerfulness, work, study, cooking, and holiness all in one. And I leave it to you, whatever has struck you about her in this presentation. So I return to Psalm 139, which I invite you today to reflect on if you so wish, and look at your own timeline. And where can we note the things we understand or don't understand, but where we can see God's design in our lives. God leads us in every area of our life. Nothing is too big or too small for God. And the best part is, God knows best. God leads us to the best version of ourselves, not just our whole lives, but every aspect of our lives.
Choose the way to confound the strong.
I thank Rochelle Lamb for that song, which I love very much and sums up what I was trying to share. Unfortunately, sorry I've gone over time.